Hello and welcome. Welcome back to Deep Noetics. I've got David Livingstone with me. He's an author on history, but specific going into esoteric history. You could say the history we may not all know about through our mainstream books, our mainstream history books, or what we learn in school. And it's quite an impressive body of work. A lot of research has gone into it, which I would love to delve into in this interview, though we may only scratch the surface given the sheer amount of material that you've amassed over the years. Hi, David, welcome, and please introduce yourself and let us know what made you get into history and write this huge historical piece that you've been working on.
Thank you. So my name is David Livingstone. Um, to be honest, research is it's not my day job. I have to have a day job to survive. I think that's part of the reality of this day and age. Um, I did begin some studies at university, but ironically, in fact, the book that I discovered a book by an academic, Clyde Barrow, called Universities in a Capitalist State. And it's one of the best books I've ever read. I really like books that stay away from a lot of speculation and generalizations and really try to um, present the case with as much solid evidence as possible. And that's pretty much what this book was. It was an account of how and what organizations were formed, who formed them, and to basically take over the American university system. And of course, that involved the Rockefeller influence, the Carnegie Foundation, and it's a really solid case by looking at the minutes of meetings and statements from people and the boards, where the money went, the statements that were made, the orders that were given. So again, it's not some, you know, just a general accusation, but an account of exactly how it happened. And it's important for so many reasons. That was one of the one of the driving reasons that led me to choose to quit university
Okay.
because I realized that for the kind of research that I was intending to pursue, the university system was going to be the last place I was going to be able to do it.
What were you
Uh,
studying?
I
Or
was studying Western civilization,
okay, so history in broad
history
sense.
specifically. I
Yeah.
would have been different if I was in engineering or computer science or something like that, and that's effectively how it's divided, right? And that's effectively what the book shows is that there's there's many channels, purposes that the university system shared, but it's effectively through Rockefeller and Carnegie, it was aligned to a political agenda. And so you have the social sciences and pure sciences. And of course, the pure sciences were aligned with research agenda, which were outlined by the same class, a corporate class. So there's a sort of appearance of that universities operate research almost independently, but really it's the criteria that are set so that the research that they conduct is fitted so that it serves a particular agenda. But then the social sciences, of course, is completely different, and those are designed to provide what I call higher indoctrination, which is propaganda, effectively. And there's many approaches to it. So that you find that in anthropology and sociology, political science, obviously history, and so forth. And it was really at the turn of the century, particularly with World War One. And this is what the study shows. This was later corroborated by a study by the Tax Exempt Foundations by Norman Dodd, I believe his name was. How these foundations basically, in fact, there's minutes from those meetings as well too of how they recognize that um, to what extent the manufacture of history or the shaping of the perceptions of history was going to be necessary to manage um, support for America's entry into the war. And that's pretty much the time when they developed the history of Western civilization or introduced it, on a wide basis across the system. And that turns out to have been more specifically Hegel's philosophy of history, and that's one that basically uh, presents Europe, and of course the United States as the culmination of centuries of intellectual progress that began in Greece, that evolved then, of course, through Rome, the middle. Well, you got to skip the Dark Ages, and then you get like the Age of Scholasticism, and then
Okay.
the Renaissance and Enlightenment.
Okay, are you speaking of
Um,
like the materialization of the absolute spirit throughout history through dialectical development of history, this kind of overarching theme with
that's
Hegel?
that's ultimately it, right? Of course, there's no direct or even subtle reference to that, but underlying that's effect. It's so this idea of 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 intellectual progress being something inevitable. So that ultimately comes from Hegel, but even Hegel himself, he derived that through the influence of Jacob Boehme. Jacob Boehme,
Mm.
well, he was that was the he derived his ideas from Isaac Luria. And that, so even like the entire idea, probably the most fundamental paradigm of uh, the West conception of itself, the probably the most fundamental myth of Western civilization would be the idea of progress.
Okay.
We live in this we live in this expectation that human society progresses, evolves over time, much like Darwin proposed an evolution of the human species or nature itself,
Okay.
and that this progress, this evolution, effectively is towards always towards some higher end.
And
And
are you familiar with works of like Oswald Spengler or Arnold Toynbee?
yeah, yeah,
Would you say that they are kind of an outlier in a sense because a kind of a cyclical view of history includes both progress and regress as a natural
yeah.
cycle?
Yeah, I wouldn't know how they, because I mean their views of history have not been that widely adopted, right? So I'm more referring to the propaganda version of Western civilization. Oswald Spengler, however, plays an important role, but that's in more in the far right, particularly through the German Conservative Revolution, which is a major theme in my one of the volumes of my recent book.
Yeah, I saw the
Yeah,
article on that. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, so it's based on the Kabbalah by Isaac Luria, which basically proposes that the history of humanity is of God coming to know himself. So that man is God, but when he created himself, he didn't know that he was God. So he evolves over time to the point where he ultimately ends up recognizing that he is God. And you find this, I think, I mean, you find it in many aspects, but it's very much articulated in the philosophy of Nietzsche, of the Superman, because that's effectively the conclusion that he arrives at. And then, more recently amongst, neoconservatives like Francis Fukuyama and people like that. But anyway, it's not a concept. That's not a concept that the average person is aware of, but generally people have been indoctrinated this idea that um, history, human society evolves automatically. And so most importantly, that's been used to justify the adoption, an imperial program of imposing secular democracy
Okay.
around the world.
Okay, yeah, I
So
understand.
yeah,
So with the Kabbalah influence, is that I read a book by Gershom Scholem. You know him,
yeah, mhm,
and he spoke of something called Tzimtzum, the self estrangement, the voluntary self estrangement of
yeah,
God, or the voluntary sending into exile of God,
right,
into nature, into humanity, that is
right.
mirrored by the exile of the Israelites, only to then return to himself to a full knowledge of. Is that what you're talking about? Just to make sure.
Yes, I'm not an expert enough in the Kabbalah to know the details of that to say, but if I remember correctly, it's related to what I'm saying.
Okay, just
Yeah,
one thing I'm surprised about is the connection to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche often
yeah,
is similar to Spengler, because Spengler was very influenced by Nietzsche, is
yeah,
often seen as someone that falls out of that tradition, right? He's seen as an anti-philosopher. He very much rejected Hegel, very much rejected this kind of Western metaphysical philosophy.
Mhm.
and is actually seen as a kind of nihilist in a sense that history actually is the manifestation of will, and is in a sense kind of you know blind and undirected.
Right.
So how do you reconcile that? In my understanding of Nietzsche, I wouldn't have put him as you did
Yeah,
into that tradition.
yeah. I know what you mean. So, I mean, he's not a Hegelian in the strict sense, right? But it's rather how the it's rather how these philosophies feed each other, and it's more of how Nietzsche, his proposition of a Superman fits into the larger scheme of things. So I think if we're to analyze him philosophically, we're obviously going to find contradictions,
Hmm.
but it's more about, um, yeah, the larger scheme of things, the larger picture of how this, because of course Nietzsche played a substantial influence on the Nazi movement and the right wing movement as well. Many philosophers in the 20th century in general, and
Yeah, also left wing post structuralism and all that, right?
yeah, exactly. I mean, and in one way or the other, regardless of what he would say, it speaks directly to the concept that, Lurianic Kabbalah, if even if you can't trace a direct connection, it's ultimately what Lurianic Kabbalah would have proposed.
Okay. Um, so that kind of reminds me of a concept I read about when reading about power, as this is kind of the recurring theme recently on my channel. Specifically, there's a work by Bertrand de Jouvenel, not very widely known author,
No,
uh, someone who's written a fantastic book just titled
yeah,
On Power, or originally in French,
yeah,
de pouvoir, and he says that that power essentially has a mysterious continued essence that brings to heel any ideology, even if it was initially uh, developed to oppose it. So, meaning that it doesn't necessarily care about any sort of intellectual consistency, but whatever serves power in some way can be co-opted and basically made to fit power in a certain way. So you could say
yeah,
that, like, in some aspects of Hegel may serve power well, some aspects of Nietzsche may serve power well, and
right.
they just kind of get combined and concocted in whichever way they fit in the moment.
Suitable.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah. Uh,
It's interesting. Do you know that of his connection to what's it called? Um, if I can remember correctly, the circle around auto habits in Vichy, France. Because I write about Juvenal in my book on in my third volume, a chapter on Vichy, France.
oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, so the Vichy regime was very much a synarchist regime.
Right.
Uh, the one probably the person who inspired the movement would have been Jean Cousteau, who
Mm-hmm.
was leader of the MSE, the movement of synarchist empire, synarchist empire movement, whatever how you pronounce it, and who was a friend of Aldous Huxley.
Mm-hmm.
He's also the one who coined the term transhumanism.
Huxley.
And so this network of synarchists there was a circle called the Solberg Circle
Mm-hmm.
around Otto Abetz, who was a member of the SS and the German ambassador to France at the time, as well as a friend of Joachim Ribbentrop.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what's interesting is what I traced in the subsequent chapters on the European Union is how so many, and because there's a whole section. The third volume covers a lot of the interrelationship between, as we're talking about Oswald Spengler, of the German, very curious relationship between the German conservative revolution and the Frankfurt School.
Really?
Yeah, the
That's
Frankfurt School.
interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah, because what happens is that, because you mentioned Gershom Scholem, right? So where Gershom Scholem exercised, and to the average person, he's recognized as being the leading expert on Kabbalah, effectively founding the academic study of Kabbalah in the 20th century. But what happened is that for a number of intellectuals, there's a great article by um, uh, which I source extensively in my book. I can't remember his first name, but Wasserstrom is his last name, about what he calls defeating evil from within. So what happens is that through being exposed to Sabbatianism through Gershom Scholem, because effectively Gershom Scholem presents Sabbatianism as an evolution, not as a side product, but as the evolution of Kabbalah. Are you familiar with the Sabbatian movement? If I am mentioning that,
Which movement? Say it again.
Sabbatianism,
Sabbatianism. No, not.
right? So this is really key because, and this is what I go back to in my latest book on Zionism, is that most of these movements can be traced back to the movement Shabtai Zvi. So he
Okay.
declared himself Messiah in 1666. And it was the first important development of the Kabbalah Isaac Luria. And so what I trace in my book is how the movement was closely connected and I believe orchestrated by the Rosicrucians, particularly a group called the Hartlib
Ah,
Circle.
the Shabbatai Zvi, I think I have heard of.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Did he end up converting to Islam at the end? Is that the one?
Then converted to Islam, and then many of his followers did the same.
Okay.
They became known as Dunme,
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
uh,
I heard that accusation of people being Dunme thrown around here and there,
yeah,
especially against, for some reason, the Saudi royal family. I don't know if there's any
right,
truth to
correct,
that.
yeah. Saudi royal family, Ataturk as well too. The Young Turk movement was a Domine movement. Them two were basically responsible for the overthrow of the Ottoman Empire. But then there was also a large contingent of Sabbatians, in particularly in Poland. And uh, I mean, the Sabbatian movement is essential because they in the in Europe, their subsequent leader who declared himself reincarnation of Shabtai Zvi was Jacob Frank, and his founders created um, his followers, particularly his nephew, which was Moses Dobrushka, founded an order called the Asiatic Brethren. And the Asiatic Brethren influenced a number of important people during what's called the occult revival of the 18th century, principally a person called Edward Bulwer Lytton, and ultimately influenced the founding of the Golden Dawn, which is really sort of the central occult society of the time. And it's from these influences because it's from um, Edward Bulwer Lytton, and then the Golden Dawn, and then people affiliated with it like Papias Pappas, Aleister Crowley, of course, Elena Blavatsky, that you
Yates.
get the foundation of the occult doctrines that fed into the Nazi movement.
Okay, and where's the connection? Just to bring it back to your statement about the
Auto
connection
habits.
between the conservative revolution and the
Right.
Frankfurt School.
So, so basically, the various intellectuals associated with the Frankfurt School, but also the transgressive movement around Georges Bataille. And Georges Bataille is really sort of one of the core personalities, like one of the early, one of the major influences to the postmodernist movement.
Yeah, yeah. I've read some Bataille, very, very strong
Yeah.
influence of like pleasure, pain, these kind of concepts, right?
Yeah. So
Sexuality.
they were all into the Marquis de Sade.
Mm-hmm.
And so they saw a relationship between the Marquis de Sade and the defeating evil from within that they learned about the Sabbatian movement through Gershom Scholem. And then so most of these personalities became associated with what were called the Aranos conferences. And they were founded by, I can't remember her name now. um, this took place in Ascona, which was a sort of a very locale, heavily influenced by the OTO, by Theosophy in Switzerland. She was also a friend of Carl Jung, who ended up working for it with Alan Dulles at the CIA.
Who was a friend of Carl Jung? Sorry, say that again.
So well, I can't remember her name. I can't remember her name. The founder of the Aranos conferences.
Okay, is that not Marie-Louise van France? No.
No,
No.
it was. I have to look it up.
Never mind. Just keep going for now.
Okay, yeah. Um, Sorry. So yeah, so the Airnos conferences, which again were for the study of really traditionalist subjects. So study of religion, study of yoga, various topics, but also all kinds of dubious connections with the far right
Okay.
and um, and the Nazis effectively as well too. So the founder, I can't remember her name, but she celebrated this, gave you know uh, her esoteric descriptions of the mystical significance of the swastika and so on and so forth.
And what was their connection to the Frankfurt School?
It's just that it's all an interrelationship of these various people. They're all friends with each other and connected with each other and overlapping friendships effectively. So it's surprising. I mean, you find that the extension of that relationship into somebody like Leo Strauss, right? So Leo Strauss ended up being buddies with Carl Schmitt, and Carl Schmitt was not only one of the leading figures of the German conservative revolution, but he was the so-called jurist of the Third Reich.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Schmidt features heavily in my work on power as well. Very
okay,
relevant writer on that.
yeah. So what's interesting as well is to what extent Schmidt's work is founded on Kabbalah, openly admitted as well too. He came up with a whole sea and land dichotomy, which is based on and the myth of the Leviathan against the Behemoth, which he gets from Hobbes, and Hobbes himself was influenced by Kabbalistic writings as well too. And he makes a very sort of strange oblique reference to Cthulhu as well too, which makes it
Okay.
especially interesting.
And there's overlap in their connections with people like Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer and these, because that's what I connect
Yeah.
usually when thinking of the Frankfurt School, at least the early one.
Yes.
Later on, you got Marcuse
Mhm.
and others, but
Yeah. Yeah.
so what is the link
Particularly Walter
from
Benjamin.
Adorno? What is the link from Adorno, for example, to some of these characters? Was he involved with them to any
The
extent?
one who had the most cross connection would have been Walter Benjamin,
Walter Benjamin, okay.
who was friends with all of them. So he was friends with Shalom and he's friends with you know a lot of the personalities in the German conservative revolution as well too.
Okay,
And
okay.
then maybe as a German, you're familiar with the George Kreis. That's a very
Ah,
influential movement
Stefan
I
George.
developed
Okay.
extensively in my latest book on Zionism. What was his name? George Stefan George.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so again, that's another one because there was also that he this is where it's connected to Eranos because there's relationships between this is the first time with my recent book that I am unable to always remember all the facts that I need.
No, you already
I I
are
finally have
are
too many.
performing
Yeah.
brilliantly with all of the connections and the names and all
Thank you.
of
I'm
that.
trying. Yeah.
So
So
I
there's
just trying
yeah,
to bring it back to like a
yeah,
common thread. So um, a lot of the
repeating
stuff
each
you'd
other.
look at would be
Yeah.
stuff that is trying to pierce the veil. I think that's a very good way to look at it when especially also when looking at power, especially in today's very complex societies where the more complexity, the more opaqueness, the easier you can kind of hide a conspiracy in that
Yeah.
sense. And so I'd say very superficially speaking, one could look at these things as a more sophisticated study of conspiracy, right?
Yeah.
A more sophisticated study of conspiracy. But to what extent are these connections, let's say, coherent and conscious? Like, to what extent do the people across history of
Yeah.
the representatives you named here in the conservative revolution, for example,
Mhm.
but also in like Shabbatai Zvi time and back before that, to what extent would these people across these vast amount of time would
Mhm.
be conscious of being part of the same
Yeah.
group, or is it also like is there an element of just the arbitrariness of history, of the
Yeah.
flow of the free flow, you could say, of
Lucky.
human will mixed
Yeah.
into that?
Yeah. Very good question.
Yeah.
And one that I'm still trying to answer.
Okay.
Um, so this is what makes it so mysterious is that like first of all, what I'm trying to do is like this is not just a curiosity, right? Like the way I see it is that when you look at the world today, there is a fundamental, catastrophic inequality which is plaguing the world. Uh, Most of that, ironically, the idea of progress has been used to try to dismiss that. So third world poverty has been treated as, beleaguered in some kind of, uh, uh, earlier stage of evolution. And as everything else progresses, they're eventually going to progress to hiding the fact that they have been deliberately impoverished and being kept in poverty. So the way I see it is that, I believe that all our responsibility as human beings is to do our best to alleviate the suffering of others where we can. So for me, that's where it starts. That's what it's fundamentally all about. So, I don't believe in giving just, $100 a week to some aid agency. I believe that we need to get to the core of why is this happening, so that we can ideally find a solution to it. So as obscure as a lot of the subjects that I'm looking at seem to be, it's taking me this long to understand what is this structure, what's this apparatus in place that is exercising this kind of tyranny. And it does so by, disguising its true motives and putting forward, a kind of propaganda to, justify or reposition their real objectives.
Okay.
So when I do that, I can find people who are actors, and I find that they are connected with various societies or organizations or ideas or philosophies. Uh, Again, like going back to the point in Nietzsche and Hegel, you can't. It's not always a uniform where you can see an exact connection, but you find a high number of connections that suggest that there is some underlying, bond. And so then when I look at those societies, I look at those ideas, you can see that you can trace them back over time, and that one leads to the next and the one before, and so on and so forth, in a chain of relationships that really you can trace back into far ancient times. And that it's surprising to what extent these ideas tend to be consistent,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, well preserved, um, effectively organized. And so I've been able to trace how those ideas have survived. They've evolved, of course, over time. What groups they've contributed to, and how those groups have how that history has shaped the actors of today.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I
what is the mechanism for that preservation? That is the mystery to me.
Yeah, yeah.
How is this information transmitted? How are these people made aware of each other, to learn from each other? Where are the commands passed on to know, that certain, long-term strategies are to be implemented? These
Yeah.
societies are all secret societies, right? We're not going to gain access to them unless we, become initiates. And so those details for now are not at our disposal.
And yeah, what I wonder with these things is generally like this question of agency. Like,
Uh-huh.
for example, are you familiar with Lewis Mumford, the Myth of the Machine? He's the author of the Myth of the Machine and the Pentagon of Power, something like that.
I've heard about it, but I am not familiar with
Yeah, so roughly, I'm paraphrasing and kind of distorting it a bit to suit my argument here, but the idea is there that there is a kind of, you could say, a machine that has accompanied human civilizational history, and that machine is basically this kind of motor of power. It is that which enslaves and mobilizes labor to serve an overarching purpose that supersedes the flourishing of the individual, of the people, and
it.
and
Right.
and subverts it to the expansion of this machine of power. And that
Mhm.
machine, he says, is it's actually misinterpretation to say that it began with the industrialization, but you just had the machine use different components. It was the beginning of the steam machine, but you already had the machine when building the pyramids. But the machine
Right.
was then driven by labor, by slave labor or whatever kind of labor. And so
Right.
in that interpretation, this kind of machine is something like an anthropological factor of civilization, something that just came about when humans moved away from agriculture, from nomadic life or pure agricultural life, towards more complex civilizations, and that then the ideologies, in a sense, that rule that govern the elites, or that are prominent among the elites of these societies, basically represent something like Jungian archetypes. They represent something like a common theme that this power structure requires. It's almost like it requires always a sort of core similarity in order to keep this power structure going. And that is where the question of agency comes in. It is, in a sense, something people contribute with, but it's also like a huge historical process, right? A huge historical process, which makes it, which is different from saying there would have been a, let's say, pure history, but that was kind of hijacked by a conscious effort that has gone on for tens of thousands of years, right? So that's why I'm saying, like, agency in these questions is such a interesting and difficult question.
It is. And of course, the problem is, I mean, unless we could interview somebody candidly like Henry Kissinger, and for him to be willing to tell you honestly, where does he get his ideas and what motivates him. I was trying to find it because I know that there's somewhere where he buried, he refused to have his secrets revealed. He was he wanted to withhold it until so many years after his death or something like that. I haven't been able to find it, but I would love to know what that is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there is, even though there is a certain common core, which you could say is what you mentioned, something like a kind of Luciferian spirit, right? Something like a liberation, a becoming God of man, right? I've recently started reading John Milton's Paradise Lost.
Right.
A lot of those themes kind of spring to my head.
It's a core work.
Yeah.
It's a core work. Yeah.
If you want to learn more about power and its mysterious inner workings, I invite you to join the course on the dynamics of power at Halcyon Guild. Link is in the description.